afternoon. Welcome on this beautiful and cold day. I won't say beautiful but cold. It's beautiful and cold. Very happy to see you all. We close our fall semester World Affairs Luncheon Series today in defiance of T.S. Eliot, not with a whimper, but a bang. Padraig O'Malley's credentials in negotiating and facilitating in conflict situations are legendary. He's just returned from the relentlessly fascinating and exasperating part of the world, the Middle East. Back only yesterday, he can give us an up-to-the-minute account of what is going on there and perhaps his insights into just how the Arab Spring reflects and has affected its environment, and for that matter, the state of the world. Padraig O'Malley is the John Joseph Moakley Distinguished Professor of Peace and Reconciliation at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy Studies at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. That's just one thing. The author of several books and many articles on topics related to divided societies, and an activist in his efforts to connect the disconnected and make divided people closer to understanding each other. Born in Dublin, he has plunged into some of the most contentious geopolitical battles of our time and has made a difference. We have much to learn from him about persistence and patience in addressing the seemingly insurmountable problems that face us. In this age of globalization, we are more interconnected and interdependent than ever before, which means that we will have more conflicts on the one hand and more reason to resolve them on the other. Please join me in welcoming Padraig O'Malley.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for those very kind words. I had no idea I had to come here and talk about the Arab Spring until about 20 seconds ago. But
I said you might give us
I had asked Sandra what kind of audience will I be speaking to, and she said, "Oh, the usual, most sophisticated, intellectual bunch of people you will ever meet." So I hope I live up to your expectations in some way. What I would like to do is probably two things: not to speak for that long, but to take as many questions as I can from you and to turn it into a conversation between us. People can have follow-up questions, or people can have questions on other person's questions and things like that. I think that's a better way of letting you come away with what you want to know, rather with me kind of going along here telling you what I think you should know. I have developed two principles over the years that kind of are the envelope for my work, these are one that intractable conflicts are a form of addiction, and the protagonists in protracted conflicts share many of the behavioral traits of addicts. Now, I've been working on I had been contracted to do a book on the Middle East, and I said, too many books on the Middle East. I will go back and say, I want to write a book on conflict and addiction. And my publishers looked at me and said, who would buy a book on that? Go back and do what your contract told you to do. That's number one. And I can go through, if you want, at some point, what are the characteristics that addicts have, the attributes they have.
Professor, I think if you move the microphone up a little bit, we might hear you better. Just move it up a little bit there, maybe.
This here?
Yeah.
This better? Is this better? Better?
Yeah, that is better. Thank you.
It is. I can go through the attributes that addicts have at some point, and the
I could just raise the volume a little bit. if you
volume,
don't mind.
sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, try that.
Okay.
Okay.
Is that better now? I didn't know that you didn't hear a word I said for the last 5 minutes. You sat there kind of being very quiet. I can go through those at some point, what those characteristics are and how they play out in addicts and how they play out in people from deeply divided societies. So just as the most effective form for the treatment of addictions are generally 12-step programs which are based on the principle that one addict helps another addict. I turned this around and developed a hypothesis that people from divided societies are in the best position to help people from other divided societies. Because again, they share these behavioral characteristics and their manner of viewing the world that is outside the scope of quote-unquote normal societies. And I have used this, once I would call it a hypothesis, now I have empirical evidence in working in Northern Ireland, and then with Northern Ireland and South Africa, and then with Northern Ireland and South Africa and Iraq, and then with founding something, I brought it down to the macro level, and with founding, I won't say founding, I will say that founding an organization called a Forum for Cities in Transition. It was going to be called a Forum for Divided Societies, but I wanted Jerusalem to be a member of it, and I was told unequivocally by the mayor of Jerusalem that Jerusalem was not a divided city. So it's these little things that are part of the problem, you know, the denial of reality. So we switched it over. In Northern Ireland, and so within that framework, the people I like to deal with are the people at the extremes. That are the people who are engage in violence, and the people who are excluded from peace negotiations when they start because they are told they must renounce violence and be good boys and girls and whatever. And very often years are taken up by good-minded people getting together at all kinds of conferences, peace conferences or whatever, trying to drill out a solution to one of these problems, when in fact they're leaving out the real actors. The real actors are the extremes. And unless you find a way of bringing the extremes into the center and finding them a place at the table, you will in fact never resolve the problem. So in Northern Ireland, where I had come to the United States in 1967 on a scholarship to do graduate work, and it was just at that period that the civil rights movement began in Northern Ireland, which I really paid no attention to. I was so glad to get out of Ireland. And then on Bloody Sunday, 30th of January 1972, when 14 young people were shot dead by British paratroopers, is that I developed an interest. Not an interest, organized a benefit conference very quickly, and was able to deliver to each of the families, went to Derry, met with each of the families and was able to deliver a check for $1,000 to each of those families. A year later, another bomb went off in Dublin, killing 34 people. This was set off by one of the Protestant paramilitary organizations. And again, I did the same thing. But it seemed to me kind of, odd that to spend an awful lot of time raising money to help the families of victims, and that what one should try to do was to try to bring all the conflicts, all the people to the conflict together, and to bring them together in the United States. Now, I was very naive. Number one, I had no money. Number two, I didn't know any of the people who were involved deeply at either the Protestant paramilitary end or the IRA end in Northern Ireland. And three, I had no idea how I was going to get these people here. But a number of serendipitous things happened. And I was able to bring 30 people to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and literally lock them in for a week. And they had oceans of, the only breaks were they got evenings where there was lots of liquor, because liquor is a very, very good negotiating tool, actually. That's been used in Northern Ireland, and it was used even more effectively in South Africa. But, all sides were represented, and it may have been the only occasion on which every side, from the Provisional IRA, the official IRA, the Irish National Liberation Army at one end, on the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Ulster Defence Association on the other extremes, and all kinds of constitutional parties in the middle, with NGOs and people who work like grassroots and trying to help people in at the flashpoint areas in Belfast, Derry, and in other places in Northern Ireland. And they nearly talked each other to death, day and night. And the one thing that came out of the conference was an understanding between the IRA and the Ulster Defence Association, as I said, the largest Ulster paramilitary organisation, that they would not target civilians. Because when the conflict began in Northern Ireland, the IRA first adopted the Algerian model. They would put a bomb in a cafe, in a shopping centre, and the bomb would go off, and anybody would be killed. But they found that by doing this, they were killing more Catholics than Protestants, and alienating more of their own people, and falling very quickly into the category of terrorists. So they redefined their strategy and said the only people we will kill, who's a target, a legitimate target, are people who wear the uniform of the Crown. That is a British soldier, a policeman, a former policeman, or a member of something called the Ulster Defence Regiment, which was a completely Northern Irish Protestant regiment of the British Army. So they kind of felt they were being more moral about the way they killed people. And of course, this was of a big dilemma to the Ulster Defence Association, because they couldn't find anybody on the other side who wore a uniform. So, what were they to do? They came along to doing retaliation killings. So what they would do is just go into a Catholic area and shoot any Catholic at random. And the agreement was that the Protestant paramilitary organisation would take great care only to target actual members of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Now that agreement fell apart some years later, but it did hold together for a number of years. After that, I went back to Northern Ireland and now that I knew all the players, and I interviewed them all very thoroughly and did a book that was very well received in Ireland and gave me access to the centres of power in London and in Dublin. Because London and Dublin were also two major players. This wasn't just an internal conflict within Northern Ireland itself. And as a result of that, in 1985, I was able to put together a conference at Early House in Virginia, where again I must have brought over about 30 or 40 people from every party except Sinn Féin. That's the political party of the IRA, because nobody would come if the Sinn Féin was being represented. This was even before the time when they couldn't come in because of visa restrictions. But the party I wanted to get in at that point was Ian Paisley's party. Now, Ian Paisley was, his political party was, you might call it a religious political party, very fundamentalist. And it was on the far right and was denigrated by the respectable centre. But again, one knew that if there ever was to be a solution, that these were the people that had to be dragged in some way. And I had cultivated a relationship. And in some of the work I do, I cultivate relationships for years, just because I know what I want to use the person for. So I cultivate the relationship until it comes to the point of where I want to do something with a person, or have them do something. So that conference was to bring into the process Paisley's party, the Democratic Unionist Party, and their delegation was led by a man named Peter Robinson, who of course now is the First Minister of Northern Ireland. And this opened up that party to senior ministers from the British government and from the Irish government. And after all their screaming and totoing that they would never sit with anybody from the Irish Republic because they had no say, should have no say in a conflict that was purely Northern Irish, I gave them a choice. It was a very, very snowy period. They could stay, or they could find their way back to Washington, D.C. and fly home. But we were not supplying the transportation. So after due consideration, they stayed. And as in all of these things, after a few hours of interaction, you find people who say they will never talk to each other, talking to each other. So that was like stage 2. And then I sat on a commission in Northern Ireland, wrote another couple of books, kept in touch with the players on all sides, especially the people who were the negotiators, and meanwhile went out to South Africa to document the transition there from apartheid to democracy. And there I had my eye on 2 people in particular to establish relationships with, and one was a man named Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the head of the ANC's negotiating team, and the other was a man named Rolf Meyer, who was head of the National Party or the apartheid government's negotiating team, but a man who knew years before apartheid came to an end in negotiations that the days of apartheid were over, and his task given to him by President de Klerk was really negotiate us out of apartheid, but keep the country together so there's not a white backlash and violence. And Ramaphosa and Meyer quickly became fairly good friends. And this is one of the reasons the process in South Africa moved at a very quick pace. And here's where I bring up the use of liquor. Ramaphosa, and I was in a position where, lucky enough that all the negotiators on every side, from far left to far right, in between, that they all would allow me to interview them in the course of the years during negotiations themselves, which meant that I was able to capture what real negotiations were about, what the nitty-gritty was, how people didn't know where they were going, how they were stumbling around more often than kind of operating according to carefully thought out plans, even though afterwards you'll read books that will show you this was the theory and this is how it was done. Well, it never happened that way. It happens through interaction with people on the other side, and sometimes very messy situations where all kinds of misconceptions exist of one of the other. But what Ramaphosa told me, what he would do is that at the end of every day, they negotiated together and they ate together and stayed together, and at the end of every day, he would kind of bring in, I want to say Irish whiskey, but I think he brought in Scotch whiskey, and he would just say, okay, now let's relax, and he would pour tumblefuls of Scotch, and he would keep everybody going drinking until about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And then at 7 o'clock in the morning, there's a bang on their door. Up, 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 up. You know, we're starting in an hour. Well, this takes a toll. And, you know, if you're in negotiations and you're going 5 or 6 days in a row, very intensively, and you're waking up with this massive hangover every morning, by the 6th day, you're willing to consider concessions you would never have considered on the first day. So, you know, alcohol has its utility and its place. But while those negotiations were going on, I already had in mind observing how the negotiators were behaving in South Africa and how they were behaving in Northern Ireland. And this is where I come back to the parallel that they all have the same behavioural characteristics. I began to develop the idea that the South Africans will reach an agreement far quicker than the Northern Irish, and that when they do so, what I wanted to do was to bring all the Northern Irish negotiators to South Africa so they could learn from the South Africa how to deal with situations that before had put blocks in their ways of doing so. So the way I went about this was that after interviewing Cyril Ramaphosa one day, I said to Cyril, Cyril, how would you like to be our commencement speaker? I'm now taking on the full authority of the Chancellor of the University. I said, how would you like to be our commencement speaker this June? And he said, well, okay, I'll talk to my colleagues. And he came back and said, fine. So then I went to Rolf Meyer on the other side, and I said, Rolf, how would you like to be our commencement speaker this year in June? He said, oh, I'll have to consult the president. And he came back and he said, president said it's fine. So back to Cyril. Cyril, what if you had to share the ceremony with Rolf? Would you still do it? And he said, hey, And he came back and said, my colleagues say it is fine. And then I back to Rolf and asked him the same thing. And he said, oh, there has to be a meeting of the cabinet. And there was indeed a meeting of the cabinet headed by President de Klerk, and he was given permission to go. Now, that allowed those two people, and it was a key point in the negotiations when the ANC was demanding that a date be set for elections. In other words, set an endpoint, or else your negotiations go on forever. And the endpoint would be elections. And they were debating that as they left South Africa and came to Boston. And the two of them were, of course, spent 4 days together. And in the course of those 4 days, they worked out between them when the date of the election would be in South Africa. They rang their superiors, President Mandela, or then Nelson Mandela, and President de Klerk, gave them the dates, and they agreed to the dates, and they were able to announce in Boston when the elections in South Africa would be. And that was another little breakthrough. And everything was done according to form. The caps that are put on were Ramaphosa was much bigger than Meyer, so they had to kind of find a way of lowering hats so that they hit the skull at exactly the same time. You know, parity of esteem all around. So that was in 1993, 1994, they had elections. In 1996, they'd written their constitution. And at that point, I went to Momeyer and to Ramaphosa and said, you know, I did you guys a big favor. You're now doctors this and doctors that, you know. I have a little request to you both. What I want you to do is I want you to come with me to Northern Ireland. And I want you to meet the leaders of all the parties in Northern Ireland and to assess whether you think they would benefit from being brought here and exposed to, for 3 days, to the chief negotiators, not just from the ANC and the National Party, but from all the parties, the far right, the Afrikaner parties, the far left, all parties would have their negotiators for 3 or 4 days. And they went to Belfast, interviewed the leaders of all the parties, one after another, for 2 hours, back to back, came back and told President Mandela that they thought that the South Africans could be of benefit. So President Mandela, being President Mandela, said, well, no, we don't interfere in anybody's conflict, so I want a written request from all 16 of these negotiators that they want our assistance. So I had to go back and get 16 signatures to a letter, which I got, and they came to South Africa. And this is where the behavioural part comes in, because they came grumbling in a way, you know, what can we learn from South Africa? That's because one of the characteristics of an addict and one of the characteristics of people in a divided society is that they think their conflict is unique. That, there are other conflicts, but there are none really like ours. And that's the first thing you have to kill, break down, is that, no, you're just one more bloody conflict like all the other conflicts. And the way this is done is in a very simple process by putting everybody around a table. And so every side is represented. And in South Africa, all the South Africans from all the different sides gave the narrative of their conflict as they themselves had experienced it. And halfway through that, you could see the heads on the other side of the table, the Northern Irish heads, you could see them beginning to nod. And once you saw them beginning to nod, it meant that that person on the other side of the table is saying something that could have come right out of my mouth. And this bond of identification is created. And it's that bond that allowed them to listen and to learn so much from the South Africans in 4 days. Now, during those 4 days, President Mandela came down to spend an afternoon, but one of the rules, one of the conditions of bringing him there is that Peter Robinson's party, Peter Robinson was there, but they would not be seen within a half a mile of anybody from Sinn Féin and the IRA. So we had to create all kinds of accommodation and eating and facilities for them, and the IRA way over here. Which brought me to a second point about addicts and about people in conflict. And it's the less than, more than syndrome. Is that it's almost like going back to your childhood, and you look at what's on your plate, and you look at what's on your sister or brother's plate, and you say, he got more meat. You know, he got more of this. I'm less, he's more. And all of these things mean something. And Robinson, in fact, his group had arrived first. And so I took him all around the way we had set things out to show him that he would have no contact whatsoever with Sinn Féin. Each of them had been set up with accommodation, restaurant, and a bar. And so I took him around the whole thing. And I thought he'd be impressed by the way we'd even plant a tree so that one person wouldn't see another person. and his response to me was, the Sinn Féin bar, their bar is bigger than our bar. And I looked at him and I said, but Peter, you guys don't drink. And he said, it makes no difference. And we had to rearrange things to make the two approximately the same size before he was satisfied. Now, it's laughable, but it's important because he thought that Sinn Féin getting a bigger bar meant that they were being treated in some way, in a more superior way, that we were more sympathetic to the Sinn Féin and whatever. And it's these imbalances that you must iron out. So when Mandela came down, even though it was Mandela, Peter Robinson's group said, if we have to enter the same room as Sinn Féin, we're not going to do it. We don't care if he's President Mandela. We're not going to do it. So I had to tell President Mandela when he arrived via helicopter that go to him and say, Madiba, we have a little problem of apartheid here. You have to do everything twice. And he smiled and laughed, and he went into and talked to Sinn Féin first. And it actually worked out to be a very lucky thing that had happened, because the Sinn Féin, Mandela can be very schoolmasterish, wags his finger, and just kind of tells you, this is what you should be doing. And he told them quite bluntly, Sinn Féin, that unless they got the IRA to declare a ceasefire, they would never get into negotiations. And they listened to him, and they said nothing because it was Mandela who was saying it. But when he went and met with the Unionists, Peter Robinson's group, and the more centrist problem, he had a different message for them. He'd been very well briefed. He said, you have two conditions which you want Sinn Féin and the IRA to meet before they get into negotiations. One, you want them to declare a ceasefire, and secondly, you want them to decommission their arms, that is, to destroy all their arms. He said, that is not going to happen. What you should do is concentrate on getting a ceasefire, and then getting rid of the weapons, the decommissioning of arms, make that part of the negotiating process. And they bought the message. And that's the way the final negotiations in 1998, as the Good Friday Agreement occurred. The decommissioning of weapons that took 10 years was something that was negotiated into the agreement. And when the agreement was announced, all the Northern Irish from every side paid a great tribute to what they had learned in South Africa from the South Africans. So now I'm kind of more sure that this model works, that when people from divided societies hear the narrative of the others, they identify, and when that happens, things click. So if you jump 10 years to 2007, through a freak incident, I met a number of mid-level Sunni and Shia leaders in Iraq, and at that time was the height of the sectarian violence. And I approached them and I said, if I could arrange for you or your superiors to meet with 4 of the key negotiators from Northern Ireland and 4 of the key negotiators from South Africa in a neutral venue, just for the purposes of talking, would you do it? And they said yes first, and then they said no. So I ignored their no and proceeded and got a partner, went to Helsinki, went to Stockholm, and in Helsinki I found Martti Artisari, who's head of an organization called the Crisis Management Initiative, and they became our partner on the ground. If we could get the people there, they would provide all the facilities. And I headed off to Iraq to try to find those people who'd said yes and no. And in September of 2007, I was able to pull 16 Sunni and Shia, just confining it to those two groups, to Helsinki, where they were told when they arrived, listen, all you have to do is listen to the Northern Irish and listen to the South Africans, and if you think you've nothing in common with them, you can go home, because they're very busy people. Martin McGuinness, former chief of the IRA, now Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, is a very busy man. And Cyril Ramaphosa, since he didn't become president, is South Africa's first billionaire. So, you know, time is money. These guys really don't want to be here. They don't want to be someplace else. So they've no problem with you saying, we're learning nothing. But again, the same process happened. South Africans and Northern Irish, one after the other, gave the narratives of their conflicts, and again you could see heads beginning to nod. Heads beginning to nod, even though it's different language, different culture. The thing is, the behavioural characteristics were the same. The way their heads thought were the same. And the same kind of bonding happened. They stayed for 3 days, and they produced the draft of a document setting out the principles they should all adhere to in getting into negotiations with each other, and mechanisms for monitoring the implementation of those principles. And they were surprised that they themselves actually produced this document. But what that conference achieved was, the real objective was that they would go back to their leaders and tell the heads of their parties that this process could work. And that's what they did. And the result was 36. I had a beneficiary at that point, which meant I could hire a private jet, which comes in handy at times. You know, if you can land a jet in Baghdad, a private jet, and kind of load people onto it, is a much more expeditious way of getting people there, because none of them had Schengen visas, so none of them could fly west. They had to fly east before they could fly west. It was too complicated, and they wouldn't do it anyway. So we took 36 leaders from every party in Iraq, including the Kurds. Now I'd pulled in the Kurds. And over a period of 3 days, they produced a draft agreement. Again, it was Ramaphosa and Martin McGuinness now being the two main men. And I took that agreement back to Iraq, and I spent 6 weeks ironing out getting everybody's signature and ironing out little differences here and there. And that agreement was signed in Baghdad on the 5th of July 2008. But the president of Iraq was there, the two vice presidents were there, and we brought in the people from Northern Ireland and South Africa. And it was an auspicious moment. But I have to tell you, just as today in Iraq, I have 2 words for Iraq: nothing happens. Nothing happens. You can have an agreement and it's worked out. Oh yes, we'll put it into the proceedings of the Constitutional Committee. How are you going to implement it? You know, it just gets dropped into a dustbin. But later on, I was able to use that agreement for something else altogether, which I won't get into today. So now I began to think in terms of, if this model works at a macro level, maybe it might work at a micro level, that is at a city level. So in September of 2008, I set out and I went to Northern Ireland first and explained the idea to people in Derry and Belfast, that I wanted them to come, and this was the idea, that if they found they had something in common with other cities like themselves, they could form an organisation that would just be an organisation of divided cities. If they found they had nothing in common with them, they could go home. Did Northern Ireland, then I went to Cyprus, talked to the Greek Cypriots and the Turkish Cypriots, then went on to Mitrovica, talked to the Serbs and talked to the Albanians, and then I went on to Kirkuk in Iraq and talked to the Turkmen, the Kurds, the Arabs, and the Christians. And I brought those 5 cities to Boston. And again, no agenda. Again, when I do a conference, I like to have no agenda. Say, you are the people who are here. You know what you should be talking about far better than any of us. Take ownership of the process from the very beginning. This conference belongs to you. Now, but first, listen to each other. And they listen to each other. And that's like 4 different languages, different cultures. And halfway through, the same thing starts happening. Heads begin to nod. They began to identify with one another. And the result was that they formed, or we formed for them, an organization called the Forum, a Forum for Cities in Transition. Now I'll give you a website number for it afterwards. We've got everything on a website. But the centerpiece of it was that each year one city would host delegations from all of the other cities and would show them where they had been during conflict, where they were now, how they had come through the conflict to some form of transition, and where they thought they were going in the process of reconciliation. And the first conference took place in Mitrovica, probably the poorest and certainly the most deadliest place in terms of an active conflict, because there's ongoing violence now over on the borders between Serbia and Kosovo, and this was Mitrovica sits right on the line. There's one side of the river is Kosovo's, and the other side of the river is Serbian. There's a bridge between that no one would ever cross. And I had, in the meanwhile, gone to Jerusalem, to Haifa, and Beirut, and talked to them about participating, and they all sent delegations. So Beirut is at war with Israel. So if you are from Beirut and you mix with somebody from Israel, you're committing a crime. So for the first day, they said, how do we take care of that? So we put them on different floors. Then they began to talk to each other, and all that went right out the window. So we had 9 cities, and they were taken around to different projects in Iraq, and in Kosovo, in Mitrovica, on both sides of the river. And we had laid down a principle, and that was, this was not a conference, because each year there was going to be a conference, but something had to be done during that year. And that meant that at the final session of each conference, at the plenary session, each city had been told to start preparing a project that they would carry out in the following 12 months before the following year's conference. And each city had to stand up and say what it would do, either to make better reconciliation within its own city, or what it would do for a city lower down on the ladder that was in a far worse situation than it was. And each of them made a commitment in Mitrovica, and I have to say each of those commitments were in fact carried out before the second conference was held in May of this year in Londonderry, Northern Ireland. And the most insignificant one was that among the people we had there were 2 of the people who had been key in restructuring the Northern Irish police force. The old Northern Irish police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, was 99% Protestant, 1% Catholic, and regarded as the enemy by Catholics. And part of the agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, of the decommissioning of arms would be that police force would be scratched and rebuilt so that it was equal and acceptable to Catholics. And as it was being rebuilt, more arms would be destroyed. And 2 of the people who had been key to putting that process were in Mitrovica, and their commitment that they would bring 5 Serb officers of senior rank and 5 Kosovo police officers of Serb rank to Northern Ireland for 2 weeks to go through an intensive course on how to start rebuilding a police force, and to have them work on the ground and see how they dealt with flashpoints to prevent where you kind of get to a situation before the violence actually occurs. You've mechanisms in place. And that happened, and the important thing about that, it was a project that was picked up by the European Union that is now funding it on an annual basis. So the second conference was in Derry, and I brought in 3 more cities. Brought in Kaduna from Nigeria. There's great violence between Muslims and Christians. I mean, when I say great, that means every 3 or 4 years there's 2 or 3 days of violence where 600-700 Christians or Muslims are just killed in a frenzy of violence. Brought in Kaduna, brought in Ramallah in the West Bank, because I wanted to tie Ramallah and Jerusalem together. And what was the other city? There was another city, but it escapes me. But again, they came, they spent a week intensively working, no breaks. This is all work. And again, they had to stand up at the end of that conference and say what their commitments were that they will have completed before they attend next year's conference, which will be held in Kirkuk in Iraq, which of course presents all kinds of problems. But Kirkuk is about to blow up, and the sooner we get crowds of people from other divided cities in there, and they have to organize everything and behave as hosts, the more apt they are to start to see the benefit of working together rather than working apart. So that was a forum for cities in transition, and now I've just come back from the Middle East, which really Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. And in the West, when I got to Gaza, which is just about a week ago, I was in Gaza. What I set out to do was, the only people I wanted to see were people who were senior in Hamas, because there will not be peace in Israel, Palestine, unless a way is found of bringing Hamas in from the cold. This present siege or blockade is the only people that's actually benefiting is Hamas, ironically. When it was imposed first, the Israelis thought that the imposition of this blockade would destroy what was the small economy in Gaza, and that the people would turn on Hamas and throw them out of power. But the very opposite happened, because the Palestinians are nothing if not ingenious, and they began to build tunnels at a place called Rafah, which is a border crossing between Egypt and Gaza, and they built tunnels underneath that you could start delivering goods from Egypt into Gaza. So they began with consumer goods, small tunnels, and they now have built a tunnel system, and there are different companies working at building tunnels, where you can order Mercedes-Benz. You say, I want a Mercedes-Benz, and they'll say, okay, we've an agent in Egypt who can arrange that. And a week later, your Mercedes-Benz will be driven through that tunnel. But Hamas takes a big cut of everything that comes through the tunnel. So Hamas has become very enriched. That's been the end result of what the siege has done. So I saw a number of people in Hamas, and they're struggling. They are trying to find a way. They have a ceasefire now with Israel in terms of they will not fire rockets into Israel, and Israel will not retaliate in Gaza. And as long as both sides keep to that agreement, there is kind of a very, very cold peace. So, but what you can't do is that if you're in Gaza, if you're a Gaza citizen or whatever, is that you can't leave. You're there, even if your relatives are in the West Bank or anywhere. No one can leave. Everyone is stuck in Gaza, period. No way out. So what they lack, what Hamas lacks, is, as it's trying to find a way out of being marginalized internationally because of it being classified as a terrorist organization, and understanding as well at this point that they can never win a war against Israel militarily. I mean, they're aware. I mean, Israel is the sixth biggest military power in the world, and these homemade bombs being tossed over, or even bombs coming in from Iran through to Syria, they've killed about 3 or 4 people, maybe a dozen in the last several years. So it's never going to happen, and they want to get into the process. So in order for that to happen, like every other organization, it's not monolithic. There are different moderates in Hamas, there are hard men in Hamas, and there are those who are dithering between one side or another. So what one needs to create is space for dialogue, where more ideas can be put before them and they can engage with outsiders who've had experience of being brought in from the cold and how it was done. Not telling them what to do, but just dialogue. So before I left, they agreed that they would agree to bringing in to Gaza through Egypt a delegation again of senior people from Northern Ireland and senior negotiators from Iraq, from South Africa. And that project I'm working on at the moment, it's just in its infant stage. It'll be very delicate and slow. Working on the Kirkuk conference in 2012. And in between, I am writing a book, which is already 4 years overdue, and my publisher is on my tail, and that's about it. Okay. And so, now, what I did not mention, of course, at all in all of this, Sandra, was the Arab Spring. So please, somebody ask me about the Arab Spring.
I think we've got a very, very rich fair, and I'm sure there are some questions. So,
This is only slightly facetious, but what can you do for the United States Congress?
What?
You apply your knowledge to the United States Congress.
the United States Congress.
What role?
The United States Congress, what can you do about it?
Oh, come on. My only comment on that would not be the gridlock that Congress is in, but that it's one more symptom of the decline of the United States as a preeminent world power. The power is shifting to the east, and the problems of this country are the problems of infrastructure, the problems of schools, the problems of manufacturing, of technology, of research, all of these things. And every index of human development among developed countries, the United States is now in the third lowest part. It's lost its edge. So in Israel, the United States is a problem, because it is so unabashedly on one side, and yet it wants to play the role of the neutral facilitator. And the Palestinians know this, but at the same time, since Palestinians get the largest part of their aid to keep their economy going from the United States, they have to tolerate it. Okay? But what the Palestinians are doing with their application to the United Nations is they have come to the conclusion, again, that violence will not work, number one. Number two, that they are dealing with the president and Mr. Netanyahu, who has absolutely no interest in peace at all. And they want to move the paradigm And moving the paradigm means taking the issue of Palestine out of the context it was in and moving it into an international context, and that is why they made their bid to the United Nations for statehood. And it would have made no difference in a practical sense, but it would have made a huge difference in a symbolic sense, which is why Israel and the United States fought so vociferously to oppose it. Of course, it hasn't happened, but it's the direction they're moving, because they want to bring the resolution of the problem, not have the United States as the neutral facilitator. They want to have the United Nations as the neutral facilitators. And what the Israelis are afraid of is that if it gets, as it did get a successful bid to join UNESCO, and it was going to go to a whole list of UN-related organizations and get membership, that if they were accepted as a member state, it would open Israel to being brought before the International Criminal Court. And the Israelis fear that. So much for Congress.
Internalized conflicts within a country, how have you had any experience with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and how effective have they been?
Well, it was part of my work in South Africa, was interviewing, again, people who were both the Peace and Reconciliation Commissioners, people who went before looking for amnesty, and the people who were never heard from. The South Africa sells its Truth and Reconciliation Commission as kind of the way to go about bringing about reconciliation. There is no real reconciliation in South Africa, in the sense that the black people are a forgiving people. And, after it was, the ANC was unbanned and negotiations were going on, there was no violence against whites. And even during their armed struggle, which was an atrociously bad one, they never targeted white areas. What the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to me did is that it created an industry. I call it the forgiveness business. The commissioners have been going now for 15 years all around the world to conference after conference selling reconciliation. Now, reconciliation would imply some form of compensation. And black people in South Africa, in the townships, are about as poor today as they were at the end of apartheid. Not all of them yet have electricity. Not all of them yet have even any kind of a toilet or toilet systems. And the unemployment rate is 25%. Youth unemployment is at 50%. And white people who thought they were going to be shriveled up and have nothing in post-apartheid South Africa have done extraordinarily well, because they have all the skills. So they can still run as a kind of semi-first world economy. So reconciliation in the end has to be between people. Societies can't forgive each other. It's people have to do it. And some of the most moving cases of reconciliation where it did occur would be where they would have public hearings, and they would put perpetrators would stand, and they were eligible for amnesty if they admitted to every single wrongdoing they had done, every person they had murdered, tortured, or whatever. They had to tell the whole truth. And if they left anything out, they were not eligible for amnesty. And in some cases, you had a former policeman or security policeman saying they had killed such and such, where that person's invariably a boy, man, mother was in the audience, who would look to the mother and say, "Forgive me for what I have done." And the mother would stand up and say, "I forgive you." Now that's reconciliation. But is it widespread? No. Is it happening in Northern Ireland? There are all kinds of people involved in the business of reconciliation. But in Northern Ireland is at peace. But people have decided that the way they will keep their peace is that they will do it by living apart. Northern Ireland today is more segregated than it was in 1998. In fact, 2 years ago, 88 peace walls had been erected between communities. They had voluntarily gone to their municipality and said, "Will you please build a wall between us?" So reconciliation exists at the top because they're the people who rule, they have the power and the perks, and Peter Robinson, the man who hated Martin McGuinness, is now palsy-walsy. Ian Paisley, who used to use his pulpit to kind of condemn damnation on the IRA, well, he became first, after the Good Friday Agreement, he became the Prime Minister. And Martin McGuinness, head of the IRA, his sworn enemy, became equal co-minister. The two of them got on so well together, they used to be called the Chuckle Twins. Absolutely no animosity between them at all. And Robinson and McGuinness are working together. And it's working at that level. But is it working at the very bottom, down on the ground among people? Not a lot of it. Because a lot of the conflict in Northern Ireland, like conflict in other places, are among working people, working class people. And they're marginal to begin with, and when the conflict is over, they're still left marginal. So, and reconciliation in the addiction model, I would call reconciliation recovery. That an addict has to follow a certain program or whatever to stay in recovery, and if he or she doesn't follow it, they eventually will pick up their drug abuse of choice and use it again. And in the same way, in societies that do not try to bring about reconciliation, if they just leave it aside altogether, they too will slip back into conflict one day. Oh.
More questions? In keeping with that, what you just said, you started out by saying that addicts and societies in this situation had the same principles in common. Would you state what they are? You stated two of them, I think that...
The whole list of them. I'll read a couple out, okay? The need to control environments, whether you describe it in terms of the political or social dynamics, territorial claims, right of self-determination, occupation, and repression for divided societies. In the case of addicts, the compulsive need to control themselves and their environments permeates every aspect of their behaviours. The need to control, and the need to assert control, denial, attachment. We say attachment when it's attached to a cause, to a conflict. The conflict becomes part of one's identity. If you are an addict, the addiction itself becomes part of your identity. And part of when addicts are brought out of addiction is they lose part of who they were. And it's a process of grieving and mourning, actually. I've mentioned the syndrome, the less than, more than syndrome. Again, when I brought the first group of people from Iraq to Helsinki, I was kind of nearly dead on my feet and kind of saying, okay, now it's over to Ramaphosa and Martin McGuinness and the other guys. I've done my bit. I see two Iraqis approaching me in very quick face, very agitated. And one says, he, pointing to the other guy, he has a double bed. In my room, there are only 2 single beds. Why did I have a double bed? And again, it's called the narcissism of small differences. He thought that because one had a double bed, he was being treated in a better way. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Could you comment on the dynamics of what's going on in Egypt?
Aha. Well, let me begin by saying that the world is full of pundits, and there must be thousands of people who are experts on Egypt, on all of North Africa, and not one of them ever saw what was coming. Ever saw what was coming. It came right out of thin air. It's now going through, as you know, the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be the leading force in the next government. It has committed itself to forming a coalition with secular parties. It has committed itself to a model of democracy that would be along the lines of the Turkish model. Islam it's an Islamic state, but it's a secular society. The Salafists, who are a very hard wing of the Sunni branch of Muslims, got 24%, 25%, a very dangerous sign. 80 million people in Egypt. Just after the Mubarak was overthrown, the military or whatever opened the borders at Rafah and let people from Gaza come over and shop for a day. And then they were herded back into Gaza. And the comment from people was, my God, the people in Egypt are so poor. It kind of turns things on its head. You think it would be the other way around. So how do you have a government being formed? The military are trying to keep control, be something above that, which would be resisted. The government or the military want a hand in writing the constitution. That's another question mark there. Everyone who comes and takes the position of a government minister has absolutely no experience of ever being in power at all. And being a minister, let's say, of commerce, what does it mean? You have to, in order to change the society, you have to change the entire structure of that department. You have to get every bureaucracy to work in a different way. The people of Egypt are expecting that great things are going to happen. Great things are not going to happen. Great things are not going to happen. Unemployment is not going to drop significantly. There will not be more food available. Already, its reserves are almost down to zero. It's almost another bankrupt nation. The IMF and the World Bank will have to pour millions and millions, billions in there just to stabilize the situation. So a lot of uncertainty. Anything could happen again, as Tahrir Square kind of proved.
About your institute,
Mm-hmm.
who are you teaching? How many institutes like that are around the States? And who are your students?
I don't teach. So the institute I was talking about, the Forum for Cities, this is composed of elected officials from that city and NGOs from the city. So it's people who run the cities. The students I have are all, I take students who are doing master's degrees or Ph.D. degrees and supervise their work. But I'm very lucky. I have a free hand to do what I like, as long as I get And I said, as long as I get a good burst of good publicity for the university 3 or 4 times a year, they say, that's enough.
One more.
I'll try to be brief. You're doing wonderful work, and you must be an optimist. And you said that all conflicts are the same in kind. But I'm wondering, are they all the same in degree? And can you see a situation where each side's red lines are so diametrically opposed that even when the enmity is taken out of it, you just can't reach a conclusion? For example, the right of return or something like that.
That's one of the. Somebody said he was a former negotiator in Israel, who would be called a peacenik. He had been a government minister. He said the problem in Israel and Palestine is that the leaders on both sides do not have the courage to go and tell their people the truth. And the truth is there will be no right of return. And the truth is, there will be no Jerusalem united capital of Israel. And that's the truth. And everybody knows it, but nobody will come out and say it. It's very difficult to talk about Israel and Palestine, because if you're in Jerusalem and you are going down a street and suddenly a barrier comes up, and behind that barrier are sealed, the Palestinians are sealed in. So if you are living in Jerusalem, you never see a Palestinian except for an Arab Israeli, which is a different category, and they're behind that barrier, and what goes behind that barrier, they've no interest in. There's no interest in. On the list of concerns today, and a poll taken about 2 months ago, the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, ranked number 5 among the concerns of Israelis. They're quite satisfied with the status quo. Palestinians are behind a wall, they're now psychologically erased, they never see them, they don't care about them, and they're living a pretty good life. That's part of the problem. One more.
I'm going to assume that most of your macro or even micro forms have to do with males. And you even said that everything looks nice here, but as you go down the society, it's tenuous at best. Have you ever thought about the mothers and the females at that particular level as far as conflict resolution?
In the Forum for Cities in Transition, we balance the delegations by gender, and all the women formed a women's coalition, and it's the only part that's really working well together. Because I will say it and say that at every level, women are far superior to men at everything they do. More commitment, more passion, and more dedication to whatever the cause is, which you don't find among males. Many males which are, hey!
Well, I can only say thank you from all of us. We hope that you will come back to us. We'd like to have you cloned if possible so that we could learn even more. But do come back to us, and thank you so much.
Indeed. Pleasure.
Thank you, Bart.
Thank you.
So you all have a brief respite from Schemel Forum programs. We will resume again in early February. The brochures are at the printers, and you should be getting them before Christmas. So get your best pens out to sign up for a lot of good things. Thank you.
We'll walk you up.